Some of the toughest men who ever lived died face down in the snow for fur. They weren't soldiers, nor were they outlaws. They were simply trappers. But their lives were constant war against nature, starvation, rival tribes, and each other. They crossed mountains barefoot, stitched their own wounds, and ate their own horses to stay alive. This was survival roulette. But what pushed them past the edge? Which expeditions turned into full-blown disasters? And how many of these men knew they'd never make it back? Today we're showing you 5 fur trapping journeys that were so brutal they make modern survival stories look like camping trips. My name is Matthew, and this is Wild America. Let's get into it. Number 1, the Henry-Menard Expedition, 1809 to 1811. In 1809, the Missouri Fur Company launched one of the boldest ventures in early frontier history. The plan was to push deeper into upper Missouri territory, trade with tribes, trap beavers, and plant the American flag where British and native influence ran strong. The company was stacked with power players: Manuel Lisa, William Clark, Jean-Pierre Choteau, Hiram-Menard, and Andrew Henry. Their new outfit hit the ground running. On April 24, 1809, they formed the Missouri Fur Company and quickly built out a plan. Henry and Menard would lead the expedition. Their mission was part business, part geopolitical power play. They pulled together a ragtag army of 350 men, consisting of French Canadians, Spaniards, Americans, hard muscle, investors, and even a few gentlemen looking for adventure. But the mix bred tension. Reuben Lewis, one of the crew, later said the group was constantly at odds. Too many backgrounds, too many opinions. Trouble was already simmering. One of the younger members, General Thomas James, kept a journal. It's one of the few surviving first-hand accounts. In it, you can feel the early cracks forming, long before things really fell apart. The group headed up the Missouri that spring, boats packed with trade goods and supplies. When they reached Fort Mandan, Lisa and Choteau split off to return a Mandan chief, Shahaka, to his tribe. That detour wasn't optional. Governor Meriwether Lewis had paid the company $10,000 to get it done. Shahaka wasn't just any chief. He'd gone east with Lewis and Clark, met President Jefferson, and seen the heart of American power. But when he tried to return home, the Arikara ambushed his party. The government needed a plan B, and this was it. After completing the task, Lisa and Choteau headed back to St. Louis. Menard and Henry pushed forward, dragging the rest of the expedition with them, straight into the wild, lawless unknown. The party pushed on to where the Bighorn meets the Yellowstone and built Fort Raymond, also called Fort Lisa. It was meant to be a winter base and launch pad for deeper pushes into beaver country, but the spot sat square in Blackfeet territory, and the Blackfeet weren't the negotiating type. However, among the crew was John Colter, the same Colter who'd twice outrun death after crossing the Blackfeet. He'd sworn off their land for good, but the size of the group gave him false confidence. He signed on to guide them west into Three Forks, deep into hostile ground. Then in March 1810, Pierre Maynard, Andrew Henry, Reuben Lewis, John Colter, and 32 hardened men headed upriver toward the Missouri headwaters. By April 3rd, they reached Three Forks. Beaver sign is everywhere. 2 miles above the Madison-Jefferson Junction, they break ground on a new post. Timber flies. Traps are set. The goal was to load up on pelts and head back fat with profit. But since this was Blackfeet ground, the expedition had no treaties and no permission. Worse still, Manuel Lisa, their old boss, had traded with the Crow, the Blackfeet's sworn enemies. So the message was clear. These were invaders, not trappers. April 12, the Blackfeet strike first. No warning. 5 men drop. Guns, horses, ammo, traps, pelts, gone. The survivors scramble. Then, April 23rd, the Blackfeet hit again. Another ambush. More losses. The camp fractures. Supplies dwindling. Blood spilled. Morale gone. Menard sees what's coming. so he pulls out, leading a battered crew back towards St. Louis. Early May, George Dryard, famed scout from Lewis and Clark's expedition, rides into a Blackfeet ambush. He was killed on the spot. His death was a pure, bitter statement. The Blackfeet will die defending their turf. Meanwhile, back at the post, Henry holds. He refuses to run. So they rebuild. They trap harder, they push deeper. There was still plenty of beaver, and yet they're gambling everything. However, not too long after, the Blackfeet return. Over 200 warriors, another full assault. The post is surrounded. The trappers are good, but outgunned, outnumbered, and low on everything. And so a siege begins. Days crawl. There was no escape, no reinforcements. Just blood, smoke, and silence broken by gunfire. By late 1810, Henry knows it's over. He orders a retreat. The Blackfeet have made their point. Trespassers don't leave unscathed. So, the expedition crossed the Continental Divide into what's now Idaho. Along the North Fork of the Snake River, they put together a basic camp, Fort Henry. But the land itself didn't welcome them either. Game disappeared, snow fell, hunger crept in. With no other option, they butchered their horses and lived off the meat. And so the men spent their winter chewing on frozen horse flesh. Bones stuck through skin, frostbite set in. After all, out here in the frontier's wilderness, survival meant suffering. By spring 1811, the expedition broke apart. Some staggered south into Spanish lands. The rest, including Henry, limped east toward the Missouri River and St. Louis. The mission was wrecked. Fort Lisa on the Yellowstone was abandoned. The Missouri Fur Company, drained and defeated, walked away empty-handed. After 2 years in the wild, all they had to show for it was frostbite, graves, and regret. But this wasn't the end, nor was it the full story. If you want more frontier survival stories, we've got hours of them. Grit, guts, and downright insane ways people cheated death in the 1800s. Watch one, and you'll be hooked. But for now, while the Henry-Menard mission ended in frostbite and failure, this next expedition's crew walked straight into a bloodbath. Number 2. William H. Ashley's expeditions, 1822 to 1825. By the 1820s, the West was still wild and mostly unmapped. William H. Ashley saw gold in beaver pelts and moved fast. Alongside Andrew Henry, he launched a bold plan: recruit tough, hungry men, push into the Rockies, and tap into the fur trade before anyone else. And yes, that Andrew Henry, the same one who barely made out of the Henry-Menard Expedition over a decade earlier. In 1822, he sent out ads in St. Louis newspapers calling for enterprising young men. What he got was a future who's who of mountain men: Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass. These men became known as Ashley's 100. The first run up the Missouri River was a miss. One of their ammo wagons, packed with 800 pounds of gunpowder, exploded before they even hit the mountains. What a great way to start an expedition, no? But then came June 1823. While trying to trade for horses near the Arikara villages, something snapped. Tensions flared. On June 2nd, the Arikara launched a surprise attack just before dawn. 13 of Ashley's men were killed. Several more were badly wounded. The survivors scrambled back downstream, shaken, bloodied, and outgunned. The Arikara massacre rattled the expedition and exposed the vile truth about life on the frontier, that the land was unclaimed but not unoccupied, and every mile forward came with a price. No story from Ashley's expeditions hit harder than Hugh Glass's. While scouting near the Grand River, Glass startled a grizzly with cubs. She tore into him, broke his leg, ripped open his back, and mutilated him beyond recognition. 2 men were told to stay behind with him until he died. However, they didn't wait. They took his gear and bailed, leaving him for dead. But Glass wasn't one to die so easily. This story became legend. Well, there's a lot more to it than this. And yeah, we got a deep dive episode all about it if you're into near-death revenge sagas. But the bigger picture? Ashley realized the old trading post model didn't work out here. It was too risky, too slow. So in 1825, he flipped the script. Instead of waiting in forts, he created the rendezvous system, a yearly meet-up in the wild where trappers, traders, and native groups swapped furs, gear, and news. No more outposts, just one wild gathering in the middle of nowhere. It worked, and it changed the fur trade forever. And by the way, if you want the full story on how Ashley took broken expeditions and built a trade empire that changed the West, got a monster episode just for that, so don't miss it after this. But for now, this next expedition leader had chaos following him like a shadow wherever he went. Number 3. Peter Skene Ogden Snake River Expeditions, 1824 to 1830. Between 1824 and 1830, Peter Skene Ogden led a string of brutal expeditions through the Snake River region. He wanted to cut through a wild no-man's land of tall mountains, bone-dry deserts, and rivers that could drown you before breakfast. His job and goal was to strip the land of fur so American trappers wouldn't bother coming back. Simple goal, savage execution. Ogden came from privilege in Quebec but lived like a war dog in the wild. He entered the fur trade in 1809 with the Northwest Company, and his early years were soaked in mayhem. In 1816, he was allegedly involved in killing a native trader, just one flashpoint in a career full of heat. Then, after the Northwest and Hudson's Bay Companies merged in 1821, Ogden became a chief trader. By 1823, he was leading brigades deep into Snake River country, extending across what's now Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. His mission was unforgiving: trap everything that moved, leave nothing for the Americans. Create a fur desert. Every mile of Snake River country fought back. Men froze in winter, blistered in summer, and limped through barren expanses with empty bellies. Food ran out often. Frostbite and heat stroke took their toll. Rivers flipped canoes and stole supplies. Morale broke under starvation and exhaustion. And then came the people. Some native tribes traded, others didn't. Tensions burned fast. In 1825, near what's now Mountain Green, Utah, a group of Ogden's own freemen, HBC contracted trappers, mutinied. They bailed, taken off with 700 beaver pelts. The loss hurt, but worse, it stirred tribal resentment as more locals grew hostile toward foreign trappers stripping their lands bare. Then in 1828, Ogden pushed south, steering his brigade into Mojave territory near the Gulf of California. The Mojave weren't having it. They too saw the trappers as trespassers, not trading partners, and so tensions snapped. A violent clash followed. Men killed on both sides. Whatever fragile trust existed between native groups and the fur brigades crumbled even more. Meanwhile, inside Ogden's own ranks, things weren't much better. The grind wore everybody down. Hunger, fear, and endless miles bred mutiny. And in 1825, 23 of his freemen deserted, stripping the team's manpower and taking years of hard-won field skills with them. It was a blow Ogden never fully recovered from. Then came the real disasters. July 1830, near the Dalles. Fast water, one bad call, and a boat flipped into a whirlpool. It took 9 men, a woman, and 2 children down with it. Along with them went 300 pelts and every one of Ogden's journals. Weeks, maybe years of notes and maps, gone in seconds. But the worst part? It wasn't the weather, the battles, or even the drownings. It was the slow mental breakdown. These men were fighting the wild, yes, but they were also losing themselves in it, badly. Cut off from civilization, stalked by death, living off scraps and fear. Some broke completely. Anxiety, depression, and total burnout spread through the camp like disease. Every dead friend made the trail feel colder. Every mistake felt final. And while Ogden lost men to rivers, mutiny, and madness, this next expedition leader lost everything alone. Number 4. Hiram Scott's Fateful Journey, 1828. Hiram Scott stood out among other men. He was tall, built like a boulder, and sharp enough to run the numbers. Born around 1805 in St. Charles County, Missouri, he too signed on with William Henry Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company. By 1826, he was deep in the fur trade, helping organize the first major rendezvous near the Great Salt Lake. Aside from being used as muscle, Scott also worked as a clerk, tracking inventory, managing payroll, and handling deals. After all, in a world full of rough hands, he had to be the reliable one. Then in 1827, his name showed up on the American Fur Company's payroll. However, in 1828, his name vanished. No one knows exactly what happened, but the end was ugly. Scott fell seriously ill while heading back from an expedition, and somewhere along the Platte River, his companions left him behind. Why? Well, that's still debated. Maybe they couldn't carry him, maybe they panicked, or maybe worse. One early account from trapper Warren A. Ferris in 1830 said Scott was floated downstream by two comrades who eventually abandoned him on the river's north bank, and when spring came, his skeleton was found on the opposite shore. Yet somehow he had dragged himself across the river before dying alone in the wild. Furthermore, Washington Irving, writing in 1837, told a rougher tale. Scott, he said, was ditched at Laramie's Fork by a starving group too desperate to help. His bones turned up nearly 60 miles from where they left him. So even half dead, the man supposedly crawled for miles. Others spun darker stories. Some claimed he was ambushed by Blackfeet warriors after the 1828 rendezvous at Bear Lake. Some said his own party murdered him. A few painted him as a hero, too sick to continue, so he supposedly begged his men to go on without him. Another version, written by missionary Jason Lee in 1834, claimed Scott pushed even farther, over 100 miles, before collapsing near the North Platte River bluffs. So the stories don't line up, but the message is clear. The frontier didn't care if you were tough, smart, or dying. It crushed you anyway. But we do know one thing for sure. Scott's death wasn't quick. It was slow, ugly, and brutal. Catching a serious illness in the wild usually meant you were done. Like we talked about in our newly released episode on the many ways one could die on the frontier, here there was no doctor, no medicine, just pain, weakness, and the creeping fact that you couldn't keep up. Scott's only hope was the men beside him. Yet, apparently, they left him. And still, despite all the stories, we don't know exactly why. Maybe they feared dying too. Maybe they were out of food, out of strength, out of mercy. But they made their choice. And Scott was all on his own. And another thing we know for sure, the spot where his bones were found, miles from where he was abandoned, means he kept moving, dragging himself forward. No food, no water, sick, starved, and exposed to the elements. Days of burning sun, freezing nights, storms, silence, no help, no shelter, just sheer will. And after his body was found, the tall cliffs nearby were named Scott's Bluff. And the name stuck. 2 years later, in 1830, the first wagon train rumbled west past those same cliffs. They became a landmark for every immigrant chasing the promise of Oregon or California. And speaking of those, we've also got deep, hours-long dives into the Oregon and California trails, each packed with brutal, you wouldn't believe it survival stories. But here's what really makes you pause. William Sublette, who likely led Scott's 1828 expedition, also led the 1829 group that found the skeleton. That overlap raises a tough question. Was Scott abandoned on Sublette's orders? Whatever the truth, Hiram Scott died hard, alone, sick, maybe betrayed, and still crawling toward home. And so far, we've seen hunger, betrayal, and death. Now comes the finale, the man who got mauled by a grizzly and kept going. Number 5, Jedediah Smith's South Pass Expedition, 1824. Jedediah Smith was tough. He was frontier forged. Born in 1799 in Jericho, New York, he became one of the first white men to cut deep into the uncharted West. In 1824, he led a rough expedition that reopened South Pass, a wide, gentle gap through the Rockies that would later guide thousands of settlers to the Pacific. But back then, it was a gamble wrapped in snow, hunger, and pain. Smith had signed on with Ashley's 100 in 1822. After a brutal winter near the Musselshell River, he was sent in 1823 to broker peace with the Crow Nation. The Crow, however, gave him something more valuable than wagons full of gold. They gave him word of South Pass, a better route through the mountains, and that lit the fire. Smith wanted in. Beaver-rich streams lay just beyond. So in early 1824, he set out with a small crew into the Wind River Valley. They hit Union Pass in February, but it was frozen solid. the snow too deep to cross. Supplies were low, so they turned back to the Crow for help. The retreat, however, wasn't only frustrating, it was deadly. Sub-zero cold, endless snow, bones aching, nerves fraying. Moving even a mile felt like punishment. Then came the grizzly. While scouting for horses near the Crow camp, Smith got blindsided. A massive bear slammed him down, broke his ribs, shredded his side, and clamped its jaws around his head. It horrendously mauled his face so badly that you wouldn't even recognize him. Yet he lived. And not only that, he stayed conscious. He sat up, told his buddy Jim Kleiman to stitch his scalp and ear back on. No anesthetic. He wore his hair long after that, covering the damage like a war trophy. And yeah, we cover that full grizzly mauling in its own episode. You'll definitely want to see it. Brutal stuff. But South Pass wasn't easy. It never was. Nevertheless, Smith's hellish journey proved one thing. The West could be crossed if you were stubborn enough not to die trying. Smith's crew was cut off from the world. No maps, no backup, no resupply. They lived off what they could hunt. And when game disappeared, so did their meals. Afterwards, their talks with the Crow went well, but not everyone on the frontier played nice. As with every other expedition we've talked about so far, other tribes often saw the trappers as trespassers, and they weren't wrong. One wrong move and arrows would fly, so the men stayed on edge. Every rustle in the dark could have meant death. That kind of stress doesn't go away. It only grinds you down. The terrain didn't help either. They pushed through rocky canyons, waded through ice-cold rivers, and froze under open skies. Exhaustion became routine. Sleep didn't bring rest, just more waiting for something to go wrong. Still, against all odds, they made it. In March 1824, Smith led the party through South Pass and into the Green River Valley, just in time for spring trapping. The mission proved one thing loud and clear: the Rockies could be crossed, not by luck, but by intense endurance. And that route changed everything. South Pass became the gateway for settlers, missionaries, and wagon trains chasing new lives in the West. And it was Smith who had kicked open a golden door for generations to come. And in the end, all these expeditions, all these brave men, weren't exactly chasing gold. They were chasing fur and found hell instead. Most didn't come back. As for the few who did, they were never the same. The frontier built and broke legends equally.